So welcome, we're really glad to have Christy with us for Trauma Informed Ministry Part 2 today. And I'm gonna turn it over to you, Christy, so you can have our time.
Sounds great. All right, let's get started. Now, if you were here for Trauma Informed Ministry Part 1, then you already know that I promised this part is much more fun. But we will do a quick review for those of you who weren't able to see Part 1, just to make sure that we're all on the same page as we move into Part 2. So let's review. What is trauma? Trauma is any kind of long-term event like abuse, neglect, a natural disaster, we would say a pandemic, witnessing violence, racial, gender trauma, and sexual identity discrimination. So those who have experienced a long-term event or events like microaggressions and racial discrimination or gender, so those things all are also considered trauma. According to the CDC in 2019, now these are dated, this is a dated quote, but trauma was the largest public health issue for kids in 2019. I would still say that moving out of this pandemic, trauma will still continue to be one of the largest public health issues, especially since we all have experienced a collective trauma event in 2020 and 2021. Traumatized students are prone to difficulty in self-regulation. What that means is that impulse control that we like to see in kids and adults, it's a lot harder for them. The negative thinking is there, being on high alert, difficulty trusting adults because adults aren't always safe in their world, and inappropriate social interactions. When we see a kiddo doing something that we think, whoa, where did they learn that? Well, they learned it somewhere, right? It's not just a kiddo being bad, quote unquote. I don't like ever calling kids bad because behavior indicates something's going on, not necessarily their morality, right? So traumatized students are the ones that we tend to see having difficulty regulating their behavior in classrooms. And neurobiologically, I'm missing a word. Neurobiologically different students cannot learn if they do not feel safe, known, cared for, and within their learning environment. Sorry, I read that sentence wrong. I have a neurotypical kiddo and a non-neurotypical kiddo, so my head was there, but my sentence actually reads, neurobiologically, students cannot learn if they do not feel safe, known. So our brains don't connect and function in the ways that for learning to take place if we don't feel safe, if we don't feel cared for within our learning environment. So this entire presentation today is just to give us tips and tricks on how we make people feel safe. We're going to talk a lot about students. That's my way of saying children and youth. But also keep in mind that if a person has experienced trauma, especially as a child, they will still carry that trauma behavior with them into adulthood unless somebody has been there along the way to help them process that trauma and to heal. So we see a lot of trauma behaviors in adults as well. And so just keep that in mind that yes, we're talking about youth and kids, but this also can be easily applied to adults. So the first thing we need to pay attention to and to do is to expect unexpected responses. So when we expect the kids to sit down in their seats or to grab a carpet square for circle time, and I'm going to use the name Trevor today. That's going to be our kiddo today. And Trevor grabs his carpet square and starts smacking kids upside the head with it. That's an unexpected response, right? The expected response was Trevor was supposed to pick up his carpet square and sit down in the circle. So we need to look for the context. Understand that it's really not about you and your classroom management in this moment. It's about Trevor, right? So don't take it too seriously. Look for sudden outbursts during a favorite activity. Trevor loves circle time. It's his favorite thing. So why is he doing this? Why is this behavior happening during our favorite activity? Or we've seen those kiddos who just start crying after they've been laughing. That's an unexpected response, right? That's an indicator for us that something's happening. Another unexpected response is the hypervigilance in the classroom. Trying for the students to try to understand what's happening, and they're hypervigilant, but then also as educators, we're also hypervigilant trying to make sure our classroom management is up to snuff, right? We want to make sure that our classroom management is all that it needs to be. And so that's going to lead us to fatigue if we're constantly trying to predict unpredictable behavior, right? So the best example of this is, imagine a soda can. All right, so there's 5 soda cans, and somebody has shaken a couple of the soda cans, and you reach and you go to open it, but you don't know which can has been shaken. You don't know how hard it's been shaken. You don't know how long it's been shaken. So, you might get a little bit of an unexpected response or some behavioral issues from one kiddo because they're just tired and hungry, right? We know those are expected. But then suddenly, if we have this burst of explosion, and there's cola on the ceiling, that's from the kiddo who has just tried to do too much and is overwhelmed. So either they don't have good regulation at home, or they're in an abusive or neglectful situation that we may or may not know about, or there's just some anxiety that they haven't been able to process safely. So there's a lot of things that can happen that can lead us up to this moment. So just expect unexpected responses, and when they happen, just take a deep breath and keep going, right? We can employ thoughtful interactions. Relationships make all the difference when we're working with youth and with children. So example, Trevor has 2 classes, right? So he goes to music class for kids choir, and then he goes to Sunday school. So in one of the classrooms, he has a good relationship with the teacher. The teacher seems to kind of clue in, hey, there's something going on. There's some trauma behaviors. How can I proactively help Trevor work with those? And the other teacher isn't as informed in trauma, and they tend to be real lay down the law. And so every time Trevor's in that classroom, Trevor's always in the corner, or he's having to play by himself, or all the basic things that we, have done in the past for discipline. So Trevor is thriving in music class because that teacher understands, and he sings his little heart out for kids choir on Sunday mornings. But Sunday school, he hates it, because relationships are very important in being able to make a difference in how a child perceives our classrooms. So interaction strategies are what we do, or the accommodations that we use to help the students feel safe. It empowers the students to take action, and we can do that by avoiding the authoritative directives, right? So instead of saying, line up, I need you all to line up, it's time to line up, you could ask your kiddo that's having some behavioral issues, hey, do you want to be in the front or the back of the line? And give them the power to decide. And so then they're deciding to line up without you demanding that they line up. And then the other way we can do some interaction strategies, another interaction strategy, is providing the reason behind their requests. So this conveys respect and transparency, so they start to understand they can trust us. What they say is what happens. So you give the reason first and then the directive. I don't want anyone to trip and fall, so will you please move your bag? Versus, move your bag, somebody's gonna trip. Now, granted, I used completely different tones of voice with those interactions to try to prove a point, but do you see the difference? The first one is, hey, Trevor, I don't want anyone to trip and fall. Trevor doesn't want anyone to trip and fall either, so he understands why it's important to move the bag. Versus the first one was, move your bag. Trevor's automatically defensive. So now he's thinking, maybe I do want her to trip and fall. That would be funny, right? Because you've already put Trevor on the defensive. So just providing the reason and empowering the students to help make decisions. You give parameters around those decisions, like you have the option of being in the front or the back or the middle of the line. we didn't give the option of not lining up, right? But we can give the options that we'll put boundaries around those requests. And we have to be specific and intentional about relationship building. So there's a couple of tricks that we can use. The 2x10 rule is 2 minutes for 10 days. So let's say you have Trevor for 10 Sundays. So you just spend 2 minutes with Trevor, when you're doing craft or doing some of those activities that allow for that space to talk, and just check in with him. Hey, how's it going? What's your favorite book you read? Or what did you do outside this week? Or just ask those questions to help Trevor understand that you're really interested in him. Then you can also do some other things like notes to students throughout the week. I know I'm getting older by the second, but I still love sending mail. I love kids being able to run in with a card that they received. Just writing notes can make a huge difference in building that relationship. If you have somebody on your Christian education team that can send birthday cards and keep up with all of the birthdays, that's another way of building relationships. And then creating an interest inventory throughout the year. This is just a little thing where you have the kids who can write or can draw. You just ask two basic questions. Who's your favorite superhero and what's your favorite color? So then when you have those 2 minutes with Trevor, you can ask him, hey, is blue still your favorite color? And he feels like you know him. It's this magical interaction of, oh, she remembered. And we always like it when people remember our favorites, right? So we give them that gift of being known. And strong relationships are really what's central to the learning process. And I would say it's what's central to the healing process. If we want to have these healthy interactions in the church to help kids understand that church is a safe place where not only do we learn about God and how much God loves us, but people love me too. So, relationships. What happens? So when students have experiences of closeness, consistency, and trust, oxytocin is released. Oxytocin is a chemical in our brain, and it has many positive effects on the brain's development. It isn't just being nice, it's that intentional relationship building. So when they experience that intentional relationship, then that oxytocin is released in their brain. So can you imagine if a kid is feeling that intentionally known and loved at your church, they're going to want to keep coming back to church, right? So when does this happen? The morning greeting time can create connection and help students understand that they are important humans and what they say matters. Giving that time to each kid to say, hey, what was your favorite thing about this week? Or, hey, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream? Or whatever. I generally like to give specific questions rather than just say, hey, tell us about your week. Because that's when you get the 10-minute stories and you suddenly don't have time for a lesson, right? So if it can be a short, intentional question during the morning greeting time, and bonus points if it is attached to, if it matches the lesson, right? So we can get that intentional layering of the lesson, but also building that relationship. The other key point of this is knowing and correctly pronouncing students' names. This can create connection as well. So often in abusive families, kids aren't often called by their names, or if they're called their names, they're called all of their names in a very angry tone, right? That when you get called by your full name, they don't get called, their name isn't used often in a loving way. So if we can use their name and give it power and give them back that identity in a positive way, it's very powerful. And then why does it happen? Emotion and learning are directly connected, and creating a positive connection means that students want to keep listening to you and want to keep the connection going. So my suggestion, if you're having a hard time getting students to listen and to pay attention, then back it up a little bit and do some connection activities for a couple of Sundays, right? Just have your whole time for a couple of Sundays be more about connecting than it is about just the Bible lesson, so that you can reestablish that relationship and that connection. Doesn't mean you're not going to ever talk about the Bible again. Just get that connection going. All right, so this is the point where I want you to think about this question. What relationship building tips and tricks have you used in ministry? So I'm trying to keep things moving. So if you can write them down, if you have a piece of paper, or file them away if you have the capacity to keep them in your brain. And we'll talk about that at the very end and share those tips and tricks for relationship building that you have used. Another thing that we can do is promote predictability and consistency. When we create a consistent routine, we allow the students to anticipate what's coming, and it diminishes anxiety. So we can give vocal or picture cues to help students transition to the next activity. So I have a kiddo who is on the autism spectrum. And so we have lived with picture schedules since he was 2, right? He's currently 17. But we have picture schedules everywhere because it helps him, and he can transition without anxiety if he knows the next thing coming. So we can do that with vocal cues. We don't have to make picture schedules for all of our classrooms, but it really can help. And it's not that hard. Happy to help you with it if you want to contact me later. But one thing we can do is just say, hey, we have 10 minutes for this craft, and then we'll play a game. We can tell people what's coming next. Or at the beginning of the time together, we can say we're going to do circle time, then we're going to have story time, then we're going to have craft, then we're going to have snack. Okay, good. And then you help them transition with the verbal cues throughout. If the schedule changes, please explain to them why things need to change. This is Communion Sunday, so we have to be shorter. So you can just say, it's Communion Sunday, so our schedule's a little different. It's going to be this and this and this, right? So give them an example so they don't live in that anxiousness of when something's different, I don't understand what's happening, and all of a sudden anxiety rises. And then the predictable positive attention is to give specifics. We have 10 minutes for this craft is a specific time frame. So they know, okay, I have 10 minutes, so I can't do the detail that I wanted to do on this. I need to just get it done. Versus, have you had that kid who's in the middle of this very elaborate craft project that they have taken to the next level and it's time to move on to the next thing? And they're devastated, right? So we tell them up front, we have 10 minutes for this craft and then we're going to play a game. Versus just saying, we're going to do this craft and then the game, right? It helps them anticipate again in a positive way what's going to happen. So it promotes that predictability that we're trying to create. And then we can teach strategies to change the channel. Traumatized students often engage in inaccurate thinking and tend to focus on the negative. Everything at home is my fault because nobody's told me that it's not. So when mom and dad fight, that's my fault. So we take that same thinking everywhere we go when we're dealing with trauma. And so you're going to have a kiddo in the classroom that thinks that everything that goes wrong is their fault, even if it's not even remotely related to them. That's inaccurate thinking. And then they tend to focus on the negative. I'm a loser. I'm stupid. Especially if they hear that in the home or in the school or other places, we start to internalize those messages and we don't know how to get ourselves out of that. Common discipline techniques allow for even more space for the negative thinking to become bigger and louder. So when we send Trevor to the corner because he can't keep his hands to himself, we're allowing time for Trevor to start going, I'm stupid. They hate me. Church is dumb, right? So we give space for that kind of thinking to continue. I know that's how we've all been trained to do. You know, we need to have some breaks, we need to have some timeouts, we need to have quiet time. But actually, that's not the best way to handle kiddos who have trauma, because it does allow them space to start to amplify those negative voices. So how do we change the channel? We can teach students that their brains are like a remote control that you can use to change the channel. So for younger kids, we might have those Where's Waldo or Find the Hidden Picture books, right? It gives them something to do and to focus on. It doesn't require reading skills that they may or may not have. Color pages, sometimes if we can give them a color page or something that they can engage their bodies Color pages isn't always the easiest. It's not always the ideal to shut off the negative thinking. But with younger kids, sometimes it's harder to find things that don't feel anxiety driven, because if they don't read well or some other things. So like a find the picture book might be the best option there. With older children and youth, like trivia, abstract strategies like, hey, count all the green things in the room. How many green things are in this room? You count that. So they don't have time to do anything other than to count all the green things and try to identify all the green things. You also want to be careful, like pick a color that if they're colorblind that they can identify, right? Saying the alphabet backwards. That requires all my brain power, and I don't have time to do negative thinking if I'm doing something like that. Or having them quote 10 lines from their favorite movie. I know a lot of teenagers that are able to do that. So a pro tip, if you have a relationship already built, or you have an interest inventory in your back pocket that allows you to know the students' preferences, you can have their favorite channel changer ready. For example, if you know they're a Star Wars geek, then have a Star Wars trivia book for them to go through. Doctor Who's their thing, Doctor Who's famous quotes book or something like that. So just having something ready, that this particular youth is going to need some channel changing activities pretty much consistently on Sundays, then have something in place for them to use. We can also give supportive feedback to reduce the negative thinking that's going on. So traumatized students interpret information through the negativity amplifier, right? So they see things differently than what's really there. We may think that we're asking in a positive way, but they hear, I'm stupid, or they think we're yelling at them. And they're like, why are you yelling at me? And I'm just talking to you in my normal conversational classroom tone. But I will confess, my classroom tone is much louder than my conversational tone. So I could, so understanding that, the kid thinks that I'm yelling or possibly thinks that I'm yelling. So the easiest way to help provide supportive feedback is to give them a positive sandwich, right? It's the positive, the thing you need changed, and a positive. For example, I love how you remembered the Bible story today. Great job, Trevor. You forgot to raise your hand during circle time. Great job explaining David's life and sharing the story. So we gave Trevor a positive sandwich. We started the engagement positively so that he doesn't automatically feel defensive. We then reminded of the behavior that we need. We need you to raise your hand during circle time. And then we ended with a positive because that's what he'll carry away. Great job. So giving those positive sandwiches allows us to provide the feedback that we need to give to students, right? Because we can't just pretend like it's not happening. We need to provide that feedback. But we also can give it to them in a way that they can digest and walk away feeling better about themselves. We also work on creating islands of competence. Robert Brooks is the one who coined this phrase, islands of competence. And what this actually is just recognizing the areas of strength and using that in a powerful way to combat their negative thinking and their poor self-esteem. So it's those moments where we counteract the negative with the positive experience. So we can do that by discovering what students do well and empower them to share their gifts in the classroom or the activity we're doing. This could be like allowing the older students to help the younger students. Offering the option to read aloud if you know that you have a couple of students that are really great readers and that would be a positive experience for them. Allowing the student to distribute materials and help organize the craft supplies. So Trevor's not a big craft fan, right? That tends to be where we see the most behavior when it's craft time. So Trevor's now in charge of distributing and helping and organizing and cleaning up crafts because Trevor doesn't want to do the craft. But we recognize that Trevor needs to feel empowered to feel good about this moment, craft time. The rest of the kids love it, so we need to keep it. But Trevor's having trouble. So we give Trevor something else to do during that time where he can feel competent and develop his leadership skills. And he didn't have to do the crafts, right? So this is another way of creating an island of competence for our youth and student, our kiddos. So I'm curious, again, take a minute and answer this question. What are ways that you have found to help students feel competent? Now, you may not have thought about it as, I do this to make my students feel competent. But you may have found some tips and tricks during your years in a classroom. And you realize now, like, hey, that's what that is. It's an island of competence that I created there. So scribble those down, or if you have some ideas of what those could be in the future for your ministry, make sure you jot those down, and we will come back to this question. All right, another thing we can do is limit exclusionary practices. Behavior is communication. Behavior is communication. It's neither good nor bad. It's just communication. So repeat that until you have it memorized and seared into your conscience. This whole good girls, good bad girls, good boys, good non-binary friends, bad non-binary friends, that's ridiculous. There's no good and bad. Behavior is neutral. Our behavior is also communication, and it may not be expressing what we intend. So I had a really bad morning one Sunday, and I came and my anxiety was already here, right? And I hadn't even entered the classroom yet. And I recognized pretty quickly that if I went into that classroom with my anxiety level that high, that my whole class was going to be that high. Because the behavior that we unintentionally exhibit in the classroom is going to express our communication, right? So it means I'm going to be short-tempered. I'm going to have a lot less patience with the things that normally wouldn't trigger me. So I had to take a step out before class started, before there were students, and take a few deep breaths and get myself centered and back into the game, so that I didn't walk in communicating something that I didn't intend to communicate to the students. Because if I went in with my anxiety that high, I would have communicated to them that I didn't like them or that they were a bother. And that's not anything I ever want to communicate. So just making sure that we understand that our behavior is communication as well as the students. The common classroom practices may unintentionally trigger students who have trauma. Ignoring inappropriate behavior. I have done this so many times because either I didn't have the energy to deal with it, or two, I didn't know how to deal with it in that very moment, right? But ignoring inappropriate behavior says to the student, I'm just going to ignore you, right? Instead of addressing the behavior, like with a positive sandwich, and helping the student turn things around. Sending the students back to their parents is something that sometimes we use, if they have pushed, like they've gotten their 3 warnings and now you have to go back and sit with your parents, but that also can tell them that they're not welcome there. So just keep that in mind. I'm not saying don't do these things. I'm just saying be aware when you do these things, what they can communicate. Sending students to sit alone. Trevor can't keep his hands to himself. He needs to go sit in the corner by himself so that he doesn't hurt someone. That tells Trevor, you're too stupid to keep your hands to yourself, right? Not our intended message, but that's probably what he will take away. And this one, rewarding only good behavior with treats, right? Like if you did everything right, then you get a treat. But those of you who had bad behavior don't get a treat. Again, let's take the good and bad away from all behavior, understanding that behavior is communication and that it's neutral. Helps us then, if you're going to give out rewards, everybody gets a reward, right? Otherwise, so either get a bigger budget for your treats or just space them out further, right? So that we don't feel like we're singling out students. So the way to not ignore inappropriate behavior is to acknowledge and validate the feelings. Oh, wow, Trevor, I see that you're upset. Hey, buddy, having a hard time. Instead of ignoring, yes, that behavior was not acceptable in the classroom. That's not how we act in the classroom, according to our expectation. But Trevor is communicating behavior to us, right? He's communicating that he's upset. So acknowledge what's actually happening. Trevor didn't throw that because he wanted to throw it and be bad. Trevor threw that because he's upset. So acknowledge what's happening. I see that you're upset. And then don't withhold your time and attention due to the behavior. Making sure the message that you send is, I like you for who you are, not I like you when you behave the right way. So channel your inner Mr. Rogers, right? And help students, be reminded that I like you for who you are. Even when things aren't going right in your classroom. That's, I always like to, I sometimes pretend to put on my sweater and say, I like you the way you are. I grew up with Mr. Rogers, big fan. So that's who I channel. But, figure out how you can remind yourself to reframe your mindset, right? Because it's about reframing our mindsets and remind ourselves that we like them for who they are, not for the way they behave, which we do truly in our hearts, but our minds may think something else. And then we can foster a feeling of safety. Again, students cannot learn unless they feel safe. If we really want them to hear the powerful message of the gospel of Christ's love, we need to make them feel safe. Otherwise, they can't hear it, no matter how many times we say it, no matter how many different ways we say it. There's so much that happens in each student's life that's beyond our control. We can't make things right at home, right? We can't guarantee that they're going to be treated with love and respect everywhere they go. That's out of our control. But we can guarantee that they're treated with love and respect in our classrooms, right? And we can help start to shift the mindset of our churches to make sure that we treat students with love and respect. We can do a great deal to build a supportive and sensitive environment where students can feel safe, comfortable, willing to take risks, willing to share of themselves, learn, and even heal. We talk about the church being a place to heal, being a place, sometimes people call it, the church is a hospital for hurting people. This is our opportunity to really create systems in our churches to allow that healing process to take place by making sure that we provide the safe and comfortable spaces for our kids.